Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, I'm going to be installing the Flutter SDK and Visual Studio Code on Windows 10. So if you're using a Mac, just switch to the next video. So what is the Flutter SDK? So an SDK stands for Software Development Kit. A software development kit usually includes two main things. One is source code. It's just a chunk of code someone else wrote. And two, it includes utilities that makes your life easier as a software developer. So the first part is Google's Flutter code is in this SDK. And when we write apps, we're going to write our own source code, but we're going to use their source code as well to kind of build and run on the actual app. Second thing is the tool that they provide is called Flutter. You actually type it Flutter on the command line. And that tool lets you create apps, build and run apps, right? Those are the main things that lets you do. So I'm going to show that to you right now. So open a web browser and go to flutter.io and then click the Getting Started button on the top right. Click the Windows button. And first make sure that you have all your system requirements there. So you have at least Windows 7, certain amount of disk space, and all of this stuff. So you most likely have Windows PowerShell. You don't have to check that if you're using Windows 10. But also you need Git for Windows, and Git for Windows is needed to kind of update the Flutter source code when new versions come out. Now, if you don't know what Git is, I will include a link in the show notes where you can read about it. But basically all it is a command line tool that lets you fetch code from the internet and update that code. So to make sure you have Git for Windows, I'm going to minimize the screen here and I'm going to open my command prompt. So for folks that are not familiar with command prompts, and that's quite possible, there's two types of programs on your computer, right? Ones that run in a window. So I have a Chrome web browser here. That's one type of program. But another type of program runs only on the command line. So if I tap my Cortana button in Windows 10 here, just is easier for me to find a program, and I type CMD, I see in my results here the command prompt app. So you might want to create a desktop icon for this later. So the command prompt was it existed before any Windows operating system existed, and back in the day you would only use the command prompt. So right now, for example, it shows me that I'm in my C users CNIC code directory, right? So I do have that directory on my computer, C users CNIC code. And instead of just managing my files here and running programs, I can do that same thing with commands on the command line. Anyway, so that's the command line. I won't drill into that too much, but basically, if I want to check if Git is installed, I just type Git and hit enter. So if I see output here, I have it installed. If I see an error, I don't, and I'm going to have to install it from this installation page here. There's a link here. Anyway, now let's get the Flutter SDK. So I'm going to click this. It's going to download the zip file. I've already done it before I started the video because it takes a little bit. And that file you'll see is here. It is a zip file. So that means it's a compressed file that you need to extract the contents of. So I'm going to select this directory, click the extract button on the top here, and then there's an extract all button. I'm going to then follow all the default options and just hit next, next, finish, whatever. And I've already done that because it takes a while on Windows. It takes a long time on Windows. And it extracts this directory here. So this is the Flutter SDK. So I'm going to double click into here, and there's a Flutter directory. And let's take a look at that for a second. So the two main things that I'm talking about here is in packages, that's all the Google's source code, the Flutter SDK, the source code I was talking about earlier. And the second thing is a bin directory. So a bin directory stands for binary. So a binary is something you can run typically. So this is the actual Flutter command that we can run on Windows. But the problem is that I don't want to have to go to this directory every time I want to run this Flutter command. So I want to be able to just open a command prompt, and no matter where I am on my computer, I could just run Flutter and it would work, right? So that's what Google is specifying here in the instructions, updating your path. So that's what so a path is wherever you are currently on your command line. So now to get this to work, I'm going to have to edit what's called an environment variable. An environment variable is a setting that's global to your whole computer, right? And there's a specific environment variable that we're going to have to add called, we're going to have to customize our path environment variable. And that's what they mean by updating your path. And if you're not sure about paths and environment variables, I have a link in the show notes to read about that stuff. So let's do that now. So I'm going to click the Cortana button, type env, and I'm going to have an option here that says edit the system environment variables. And here I'm going to click the environment variables button. And then up at the top here for my user, I want to edit the path environment variable. So I'm going to hit edit, and then I'm going to hit new and add a new path here. And I'm going to cite the path that's, I'm going to include the path to the Flutter bin directory. Now, before we do that, we're going to have to find a home for my Flutter directory. I don't want it to live in the downloads directory because I can delete it by mistake, right? Sometimes I clean out my downloads folder. So as a best practice, and what Google recommends, and I recommend it also, is we want to right-click this Flutter directory, select cut, go to my C drive, and create a directory called SRC. And SRC is just an industry terminology that stands for source code. It's just a convention that's existed forever. And I'm going to go into my SRC directory I create. You're going to have to create it if it's not there. And I'm going to right-click and hit paste. And now it's going to move the Flutter directory here. And now my path to the Flutter bin directory, see I select Flutter bin, this is going to be my path, right? So I'm going to type in that path here. So I'm going to go back to my environment variables. I'm editing my path variable at the moment. I'll show you, see path here. I hit edit, hit new, type C:\\, make sure it's a backslash, not a forward slash. This is a forward slash, this is a backslash. SRC /flutter bin. So I hit OK. Hit OK. And now for the changes to take effect, I have to reopen the command line. So I'm going to X out of this, hit the Cortana button, type CMD, command prompt. And now if I type Flutter and then hit enter, I'm now going to see that the Flutter command works, right? I can run it from wherever I am. If I'm in the C directory, I can still run it, right? So it doesn't matter where I am. So, and if you don't know basic command prompt commands, like it's really important that you know two of them to start off with. One is the one I just did, which is CD. It stands for change directory. I'm changing a directory. Another one is dir, and this is on Windows. dir lists all the files and folders on your computer based on the directory you're currently in. Anyway, we're not going to use the command line much for Flutter development because those tools that I'm running on the command line are already built into our Visual Studio Code, and we're going to install that next. So part 1 is done. Okay, so let's get to part 2, and so that is installing Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is an IDE, and that stands for Integrated Development Environment. So I'm going to search for Visual Studio Code on Google, and it should be the first link here. And I'm going to click Download for Windows. So I've already downloaded it just to kind of get it out of the way for the video. And you'll see this in the download directory. We're going to double click it. And just choose all the default options it gives you. So hit next, accept agreement, next. Now I can say create a desktop icon, sure, if I want. Just keep all these options. It's going to install. So anyway, as I was saying, what an IDE is. So an IDE is integrated development environment, and all that is a fancy text editor. So you're not going to edit your source code with Notepad or something. You're going to edit with an IDE, meaning an IDE gives you specific tools that just makes your job as a software engineer easier. Specifically, it will automatically format your code. So make sure the right indentation's there, the right line breaks are in there when you save your file. It's going to also highlight code so you can read it easily. It's also going to let you run and build code, debug code from the IDE itself rather than using a command line. So those are the high-level main things an IDE actually does. So I'm going to say launch Visual Studio Code. And to get Flutter integrated with the IDE here is we're going to have to install what's called an extension for Visual Studio Code. An extension is just a plugin, essentially, and it's, of course, free. And I'm going to click View here and hit Extensions. I can also click this square icon here. I don't know what it is, but and I can now search the Visual Studio Code marketplace for extensions. So one of them is Flutter. So I'm going to type Flutter, hit install. And that's mainly it. It's an optional extension, is the Material Dark theme. It just gives you, it highlights your code and just makes it look nicer using a dark theme. That's all, a dark color theme. You can change your color theme by going to File, Preferences, Color Theme. So, and I can hit up or down, the up or down arrow. And as you can see, some people, prefer a light color theme. Some people want to look cool. But actually, to me, it's easier on my eyes to use a dark theme, right? So to use the Material Dark theme, I can hit Reload, reloads the application, and now I can use it. So let's say I have some source code open. Oh, it doesn't matter. I can show you anyway. Go to Preferences, Color Theme, and now I can hit the down arrow and choose the Material Dark theme. So that's the Material Dark theme. It just looks nicer. Cool. So we have Visual Studio installed, and I installed the Flutter extension. And next, we're going to actually generate a Flutter project. Okay, so next we're going to actually install an Android emulator. So we're going to generate an Android, a Flutter project, but we need to run it on something, right? It could be a physical device or what's known as an emulator. And an emulator is basically a virtual device. So what I need to install Android, an Android emulator with is something called Android Studio. Android Studio is an IDE as well, and it's free. I'm just going to search for Android Studio, and I just hit download. I've already downloaded and installed it, so like get it out of the way. And usually people developing Android apps, not Flutter like only apps, but Android specific apps, use Android Studio. People do use Android Studio for developing Flutter apps. I just like Visual Studio Code better because it's just more user friendly, especially to junior developers. But I personally just like Visual Studio Code also for just normal development. But what Android Studio gives you is I'm already running it right now. So I've started up Android Studio. It gives you something called the AVD Manager. So if I go to Tools and I'm going to select AVD Manager or Android Device Virtual Device Manager, it's going to let me create an Android device. So I'm going to hit Create Virtual Device. And I'm just going to highlight Pixel 2 because it's just a common phone. Each phone has its own like screen dimensions and all that. Doesn't really matter right now. The next thing is I'm going to install an image. So this each one of these is a different like Android SDK version that will run, a different Android operating system that will run on your phone. So I'm going to just highlight the latest, and I already downloaded this one. So, but for you, you're probably going to tap a download button. You'll have a download button here. You're going to tap that. It's going to install it. And what that is, it's going to run Android 9.0. And if you watch this video later, it'll be a later version probably, and it's going to use a specific Android API version. So as we get more advanced in Flutter development, you want to test your Flutter code against different versions of Android to make sure it's running on all types of devices. But this is fine for now. So I'm going to hit next. I don't need to name it. I just hit finish. It's going to create that. And on the right here, there's a play button. So I'm going to run my Android device emulator. And it will start up. And while it's starting up, I'm going to just minimize Android Studio. And now I'm going to create a Flutter project. So I'm going to now need a home for my Flutter code, right? I need a directory where I'm going to create all my Flutter code. And I'm going to use the File Explorer to do that. So I'm going to go to C, Users. I'm going to highlight my, double-click my username. And then I'm going to select New Folder. And I'm going to type in code. And so this is the path to all the projects I want to create. I'm going to keep all my projects in the same place, right? So let's go to there on the command line. So I'm going to say cd C:\/ users, my username, right? And then I could type dir, I could see all the files here. I see a code directory, so I can say cd code, so change directory to code. And now I have nothing here, right? So now I'm going to create the Flutter project. So the Flutter command has a lot of options to it, and we won't go over all of them. Oops, this crashed for some reason. Let me restart my Android emulator. So the Flutter command has a lot of options to it. You can say Flutter run, as you see here, Flutter build, right? Flutter creates, etc. So the command we're going to use for now is Flutter space create space, and then the name of the project I want to create. So the project we're going to create is Hello World. So hello underscore world. In the Dart Flutter world, if you have a space, always use an underscore. You don't ever use a dash here. It's not going to let you do that anyway. You can use an underscore. Make sure it's always under lowercase. So any files or projects you create are always lowercase. And then I'm going to hit enter. All right, my phone's running now on the right. So I'm going to put my phone up here, and then boom, it's done. Okay, so it says I can say cd hello world, and I can say Flutter run, but I'm not going to do that. I can use my IDE to run the project. So in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to say File, Open Folder, and go to my code directory. I already have it open here. Highlight Hello World, and just say Select Folder. So what that's going to do is load the entire contents of that created Flutter project here for me, right? So there's 4 main directories: Android, iOS, lib, and test. So Android and iOS, well, let me run the project first, and while we're waiting, I'll go over that. To run the Flutter project, I'm going to say debug at the top and say start debugging. So debugging is something I'll go over in another lesson, but effectively that means you're going to run your project. It's going to compile your code and run it. I can alternatively hit F5. So I'm going to hit F5. And then it's going to say select environment. So I'm going to select Dart and Flutter. And I'm going to kind of resize my window here so you can see the Android emulator on the right and my code on the left. Okay, so anyway, while that's running, let me explain some other basics to you. The files that a Flutter project has is Android and iOS. Each one of these files are the configurations you need to kind of like submit your apps to the app stores, right? So if I'm building an Android project and I want to configure the app icon for it, I'm going to configure a certain file and add some assets into this Android directory. And I'll cover that in another lesson. Same for iOS. Also, if all my source code is in lib or library. So all my source code I write, I'm going to organize it here. By default, there's a main.dart file that will run. There's a test directory. These are all my tests. I'm also going to cover that in another video. And lastly, there's this temporary directory called build, and you don't need to be concerned about that. That's the just stuff that's generated when I build my code. So cool, my Flutter app is running. For all students or anyone who's a newcomer, do not open main.dart and read through it because it's overly complex and it just will kind of, it's intimidating to look through. We're gonna be gutting this project in another upcoming video, and we're going to be starting from scratch with just far simpler code, right? So just, you don't need to look at that for now. Cool. So again, my Flutter app is running, and yeah, like it just shows some text on the screen and a button, and that's it. So lastly, a few more things just to orient yourself with Visual Studio Code. This bar appears when I'm running an app. I can hit stop to stop the app, and I can hit this to just completely reload it if I want to. Of course, I'll go into the hot reload feature later. More on that later. And these are just icons for debugging. Again, you don't need to worry about that for now. On the left here is my file explorer. I can hide it and show it if I want more room. I can hide it by clicking on it. I can search all code in my project here. This is just stuff for Git or source control. You don't need to be concerned about that right now. Debugging tools, install extensions, and lastly, show test output. So if I'm running tests, it just gives me an easier way to see how my tests have run. In the middle here is where you edit your code. And also at the bottom here, this is kind of like contextual information for you. It's low level information. So if the app crashes or something, it'll give you some information here on what happened. You don't need to be concerned about it right now. You can just hide it by clicking the X, and you can hold Control J and to toggle it hidden or not hidden. Cool. I guess that's it. So thanks for watching.